If you remember last week, we talked about what is truth, is it knowable, which we of course established it is. And now we're going to, as the title says, why should anyone believe anything at all? Why should we believe anything at all? Start off with a quote. People almost invariably arrive at their beliefs not on the basis of proof, but on the basis of what they find attractive. Do you agree with that? Generally speaking? All right, everybody kind of goes off of what they believe based off of their feelings, based off of what they like, what they prefer. So, why do they believe what they believe? Let's talk about a few areas that we get our reasoning from. Sociological reasons, environmental reasons, parents, friends, society, culture. Pretty simple, straightforward. Psychological reasons, comfort, peace of mind, meaning, purpose, hope, identity. Okay? Religious reasons. We all know this. Scripture, preachers or priests, gurus, I'm to church, Islam, depending on where you are.
You really put guru up there?
Put guru up there. They're out there. They are out there. And of course, philosophical reasons based on consistency, evidence, completeness. So, question. The first three, sociological, psychological, religious, are those by themselves, are they good reasons to believe something?
Yes,
Okay, why?
because we're all here because, well, I don't say all, but some of us are here because we grew up in the church. So our environment, our parents, our friends, had an influence on with number one. For Christians, I would say that definitely applies.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
I think about when Marty was they were in the Philippines, and that entire country is Muslim. You know what I mean? They're teaching about Christ and how the chances of them, turning over traditions, turning over families, turning over all the above, just so they can learn about Christ. Someone would have to be willing to give up all of that, just because it's been ingrained in them. And that plays a massive psychological problem. I mean, we see it here with denominations and stuff, but imagine an entire different religion.
So the question again, the first three, are they in and of themselves, by themselves, disregard the fourth for a moment, are they a good reason to believe anything?
No,
Why?
because you didn't like his answer.
I'm glad you're here. So, okay, let's start with environment. Parents. Have your parents ever been wrong when they tell you something, teach you something?
No.
Never, right? Who's that? Those are parents are here with them, right? Okay, friends, we know that they lead us astray a lot.
Lightning.
What about society? Is society ever wrong? Daily. Simple, very simple example. The Germans, 30s and 40s, what do? Were they right or wrong? Okay, what about psychological reasons? If something is comfortable, if it gives you peace of mind, is it a good idea to believe it just because of that?
That's what the 60s were all about.
Yeah, I wouldn't know. What about religious purposes? Now, obviously, we all identify more with this one, right? We're here. We're at the church. We're with the church together for religious reasons. But, and again, before I go on to this one, remember where we're coming from for this book. The purpose of this book is to prove that it takes more faith to be an atheist than it does to be a theist or to believe in God. Okay, so we're coming from, right now especially at the early part of the book, we're coming from an angle of coming to someone who doesn't even believe truth or questions if there's truth. Okay, so this is kind of a broad brush thing here. So religious reasons. Just because a book, and again, I'm not just speaking of the Bible here, just because a book tells you to live a certain way or to believe a certain thing, is that a good reason to believe it?
We have a book that's falling apart. And we believe it, and we want to follow it.
Yep.
There are other religions that have their own book
Yep.
that teach if you don't believe like them, you're an infidel and you need to be killed. Is that something we want people to believe? Is that a good enough reason to come to truth because it's in a book?
So on the inside of religion, let's look at two books specifically. We have the Bible. 1 Corinthians 15, 1-8 tells us that Jesus died and rose again. Okay, we all believe that. However, in Islam, in Surah 4, 157, it states that Jesus did in fact live, but he didn't die. He didn't die on the cross. So again, with the broad term of religion, we have a contradiction. So is religion, broad term, a reason to believe something? A good reason? Now, this leaves us with the final one here, philosophical reasons. And the classic sense of the word, philosophy means finding truth through logic, evidence, and science. Finding truth through logic, evidence, and science. Now, what am I saying here? I'm not saying religion's wrong, but what are we doing? What is this class about? It's about gathering the evidence. Think about it from the point of view of an atheist or someone who's trying to understand. To them, this is a book. Until we can prove to them otherwise. You can preach from this book to someone who doesn't believe it's the Word of God, and nothing's going to happen. I've seen it, I've done it myself. Until they believe that there is a God and that is His book, it's just another big piece of paper to them. Does that make sense? So, we have evidence, we have logic, we have reason, we have science that backs up the book, that backs up what we believe. All that this tells us, that any teaching, religious or otherwise, is worth trusting only if it points to truth. We talked a lot about truth last week. It's only worth believing if it points to truth. Many beliefs that people hold today are not supported by evidence, plain and simple. Your average person doesn't spend a lot of time really digging into what they believe and why. They just don't. But only the subjective preference of those holding them, and in order to find truth, one must be ready to give up their subjective preferences and in favor of the objective truth. So you have to be able to step back from what you believe if you haven't studied and dug in and look at the actual facts. So as I talked about, we're going to be focusing on this logic tonight. But what kind of logic? Whose logic? Well, according to relativists, there's primarily two sources of thought here. There's Western logic, which is an either-or reasoning, and we'll get into what that means here in a minute. And there's Eastern logic, which is a both-and logic. I'm going to try not to lose you guys on this stuff. It's kind of circular and kind of weird. We were just talking before this. I had to read the chapter several times, which really makes sense, so bear with me. So, as an example, in the West, with the either-or logic, Jesus either is the only way to God or He's not. There's no third option. Either He is or He isn't. However, in the Eastern logic, you can believe that salvation is only through Jesus, but you can also, at the same time, believe that people can be saved in other ways. It's pretty common over there in the East, primarily in India, that people, even people who proclaim to be Christians, also espouse to parts of Hinduism, saying that their Hindu relatives are also equally saved. It is both one way and many ways. So they have a lot less of a problem with contradictions than we do in the West. Everyone's right, even though they contradict one another. A relativist that says you must think this way if you are in the East versus the West. So it's that argument of our truth here in our culture is different than the truth over there. You've heard that before? People will proclaim that it depends on where you are, what the culture says. One in Rome, do as Romans, you know? So, who here remembers a Roadrunner from last week? Who wasn't here last week? You guys know what I'm talking about.
Okay,
Awesome.
that helps.
Dalen, can you share what that is?
Sure. Real quick though, faith covers the gaps where there is no knowledge or there is no evidence. Okay, so this book is trying to prove that atheists need more faith because there's less evidence that evolution happened or less evidence that there is no God. Okay, they have to discount all this stuff to say there isn't a God. So that's kind of one point. The Roadrunner tactic is there are statements that we constantly hear but we don't think about that are self-defeating statements. It's like the statement, there is no truth. Well, if someone said that to you, basically they're the coyote, they go run off the cliff, the stop as a Roadrunner, and he stands on the cliff and says, there is no truth. And you say, well, is that a true statement? Because if that's a true statement, now there is truth, and his argument falls right underneath his feet, right, and he falls down, right? So there's tons of these that are out there that we just have become part of this, and instead of either or, we go to this and mode, right? We're both and. So, but in every religion, there's mutually exclusive different views, and so we can't all be right. Were you going to talk about the the atheist who's Catholic?
Not good.
So in the book, it talks about this guy. He's an atheist. He's a professor, and he says he's a Catholic. And he says, how can you be an atheist and a Catholic? And he says, you don't have to believe in God to be a Catholic. You just got to follow the rules. That was his point, right? So he didn't believe in God, but he still wanted to claim to be Catholic.
There he is.
I just
So-
found the same picture.
Did you? That's pretty popular. Someone insists you must use both and logic. Simple response to that. This is kind of an example of the coyote method or the Roadrunner tactic. You'd say, are you saying that when I'm in India, I must use either both and logic or nothing else? Does it make sense? You're not using, their logic falls flat. And there's several of these scattered throughout the book. You'll see better ones than this one. This one's only neat. But this shows how their logic is backwards and wrong, how it actually contradicts itself. Things do work the same regardless of where you are. It doesn't matter if you're here in the west or if you're out in the east. If you're going to cross the street and there's a car coming, you're either going to get hit or you're not. 2 + 2 is always 4. It doesn't matter where you are. Even though I hear otherwise nowadays. Gravity works the same no matter where you are. Truth is truth, period.
And truth is truth, no matter what I believe about it.
Yep.
If I think that 2 + 2 is something other than 4, and I believe that, it's still not true. Because what is true is true.
Absolutely. Now, next one.
There's a joke in the oil field that says, if you ask an engineer what 2 + 2 is, he'll say 3.999999999 repeated. If you ask a geologist, he'll say it's somewhere between 3 and 5. And if you ask a logging engineer, he'll say, what do you want it to be? Make it whatever you want it to be.
All right, for our first term. Sure, everybody knows what this is just by looking at it. The law of non-contradiction. Very Western logic, right? It says contradictory claims cannot be both true at the same time in the same sense. Of course, makes sense, right? I like his example. So if you're walking down the street, you see a married couple. You say, hey, I hear you're expecting. The wife says, yeah. Husband says, no. Do you say, okay, thanks, cool, and you walk away? No. Now you have more questions. Did they misunderstand you? Did she not tell him? In which case you're in big trouble and she stayed away? Or is it something more diabolical? Who knows? But obviously it's a contradiction. So obviously it doesn't work.
But in the East,
But in the East,
it
they'd
would
be
be
like,
accepted.
I guess she is and she's not. Everyone's right. Kumbaya. This next one's fun. A Muslim philosopher named that he had a really great suggestion to test people who deny this law of non-contradiction. Anyone who denies the law of non-contradiction should be beaten and burned until he admits that to be beaten is not the same as not to be beaten, and to be burned is not the same as not to be burned. A little extreme, I'm not saying we should do that, but it proves the point, right? I mean, you're not going to sit there and be burned and say, I'm not really being burned. Law of non-contradiction. Anything else to add to that, guys?
Pretty straightforward on that one.
Yeah. All right, moving on. David Hume. Anyone ever heard of David Hume? David Hume is perhaps more than any other person, the most responsible person for the modern day skepticism, the school of thought of today. He believed that all meaningful ideas were either true by definition or must be based on sense experience. Either true by definition or based on sense. You can experience it with one of your senses. Smell it, taste it, whatever. Which means all metaphysical claims, since they can't be experienced by our senses, which includes God or any kind of religious type belief, must not be believed and is therefore meaningless. Does this sound familiar at all? If you've had any modern college classes in logic or even literature, you've probably seen similar thought quite a bit.
If you can't feel it with your senses, there's nothing to believe in.
So, he asserted that propositions can only be meaningful if they meet one of these following criteria. Truth claim is abstract reasoning, such as a mathematical equation or definition. So 2 + 2 = 4. Or also, pretty simple, all triangles have 3 sides. It's just true. It's a fact. Or truth claims can be verified empirically through one of the 5 senses. Again, you can see it, smell it, taste it, which is why he was so against any form of God, whether it's the Christian God, the Muslim God, whatever. You can't see them, you can't experience them in a physical sense. So if this is correct, and this is something he espoused very heavily, if this is correct, all religious writings, all religious documentation of any sort should be committed to the flames, because most of it speaks of things you can't physically experience or is automatically true in and of itself. Now, we'll deal with the contradiction here in a moment, but 200 years later, this guy, A.J. Ayer, converted these ideas into the principle of empirical verifiability, which is a mouthful. And this claims that a proposition can be meaningful only if it's true by definition or if it's empirically, I'm going to mess this up, verifiable. Pretty much the same thing, right? If it's physically there or if it's by definition true, then it must be true. By the mid-1960s, this was all over universities in America. Did anyone ever heard of A.J. Ayer? No? They're actually both pretty well unknown, but their thoughts have progressed to a lot of what we're seeing today. Now, another really good story that was shared in the book. Norman Geisler, one of the writers, was in college, I'm assuming probably in the 60s, maybe early 70s. And he was in a class where the professor was all about this principle. And he had all the class prepare a speech verifying this principle. So Geisler was pretty excited about this. He was one of the first to go. The professor said, hey, you got about 15 minutes, and then we're going to save time for questions. No problem. So Geisler simply walked to the front, here's the coyote again, and said this: the principle of empirical verifiability states that there are only 2 kinds of meaningful propositions: those that are true by definition, those that are empirically verifiable. Since the principle of empirical Empirical verifiability itself is neither true by definition nor empirically verifiable. It cannot be meaningful. Did that make sense to anybody? I'd read it like 5 times a day. Those words are awful. It's contradicted itself. His own argument defeated itself. And the more we go over this throughout this book, you'll start to see them everywhere. You'll start to see the mainstream thoughts and how they contradict themselves, how they defeat themselves over and over again. And it makes our job a lot easier of standing up for truth. Because if someone's intellectually honest, they'll see it pretty quick when you point it out. So in short, the claim that something can only be meaningful if it's verifiable or true by definition excludes itself, because that statement is neither empirically verifiable or a true definition. Hume and Iyer both try to prove too much by excluding too much. Everybody following so far? I'm not trying to insult anybody, but like I said, this stuff's woo. It'll get you quick. Anything to add to that?
No?
Okay, too.
Right, Richard?
All right, everybody tracking so far? Cool. Let's leave it one. No, I did that number. I forgot about that. Sorry. All right, we have one more philosopher to thank for brilliance. Immanuel Kant. He was specialist in agnosticism. And according to Kant, there's no way to know anything about the real world at all.
This guy's my favorite.
Yeah. This is a little simpler to explain.
That's my favorite.
Hold on, let me make a comment.
Go ahead.
In the Pathfinders class Sunday, Daryl Davis, he loves the fact that someone who's brilliant can take such a tough subject and they can simplify it to where we can understand it, right? And my first thought in that class was, does that mean the opposite is true, where idiots take the simplest subject and blow it up into this massive thing?
That's actually one of the quotes I have in here. If you want to make an obvious seem obscure, just let a philosopher get a hold of it. Right? So we can't know anything in the real world. The structure of your senses and your mind forms all sense data. So you never really know anything about the thing in itself. You only know the thing to you, what your mind has made it become in senses form. So picture it this way. If you look out the window and you see a tree, according to Kant, you're not really seeing a tree. You're seeing whatever your mind tells you you're seeing. But you have no way of knowing what you're actually looking at. It sounds kind of like the Matrix. Like you're not physically seeing anything, but something being programmed into your mind, right? C.S. Lewis said, good philosophy must exist, if for no other reason, because bad philosophy needs to be answered. This is a horrible philosophy, and it doesn't take a philosopher or a genius to see it. So according to Kant, we are locked in complete agnosticism about the real world. We really can't know anything.
Can't know anything.
Coyote's coming in hot. So what's wrong with the argument?
Well, if you have a mind and you say, okay, well, anything my mind tells me is false, or for instance, love. Well, what is love? Well, I don't know. I just know what it is. Well, it's an intangible thing. Then it must not exist, right? Love can't exist because you can't taste love, you can't smell love, you can't hear love. You know what I mean? You can't. What is love? So if you take one of those and argue that argument from that point of view, it kind of makes these guys seem kind of thin because and you turn their argument on itself, it doesn't make any sense. You know, kind of like what you did with earlier with Immanuel Kant.
But these guys are enlightenment philosophers, right? They're enlightened guys.
Yeah, but Kant's a little bit insane. Because, I mean, he's talking about a mind, your mind is telling, well, is that really your mind?
Yeah, you can't trust your mind.
Do you really have a mind?
Very true. Very true.
How does this guy tell us that what we see isn't a tree when he's clearly saying it's a tree? But we can't know it's a tree, but somehow he knows it's a tree, right?
With that being said, yeah, Kant contradicts his own premise by saying that no one can know the real world while he claims to know something about it, namely that the real world is unknowable. The truth about the real world is that there is no truth. Is that true?
Then there's truth.
Is it true that the world has no truth? What's wrong with that statement?
How can he say that? It's
Exactly.
true that
Self-defeating.
if there
argument.
is no, it's self-defeating.
Self-defeating argument. Again, the same stuff we're seeing in all these cases. Their own arguments are self-defeating. Their own arguments are being turned over on themselves. This repeats over and over and over again. Kant is also making a logical fallacy called the nothing but fallacy. This is a fallacy because nothing but statements imply more than knowledge. Kant says he knows the data that gets to his brain is nothing but phenomena. How does he know?
You can't trust his brain.
In order to know this, he would have to be able to see more than just the phenomena. So he's saying that we can't see what things really are, but somehow he knows that we can't see how things really are. Kind of self-defeating. And we're
Kind of like
different-
nothing created nothing. Nothing created something.
Yep.
So it's essentially saying because our people's experiences are somewhat subjective. You may see a different shade of green, and I see what we call it green. So it's saying because these are subjective experiences, then we can't know, but we'll just accept these to be true.
Yeah, so essentially I see quite a few people in here. He would argue my senses, my eyes are creating this projection of people, but I have no way of knowing if there's actually people here. There could just be one or two. My eyes are seeing multiple, I might be hearing multiple, my senses aren't telling me the truth, they're telling me whatever they want to tell me. But how does he know that? I'm assuming he's human too, seeing the same thing we are. So in order to differentiate the things in the real world from that which his mind perceives, he would have to be able to see both. But this is exactly what he says can't be done. He says you can't know what you, this is where philosophy is fun. You can't know what the true world looks like, what the real world looks like, because your senses are telling you a different story. I gotta pick it up, we're running out of time.
It kind of goes back to a skeptic person who doesn't believe in religion because he's skeptical of it, believes in skepticism. He believes in something, or she believes in something. It's just not religion. They can't say they don't believe in it because they still believe in something.
So Hume and Kant are wrong. But that doesn't necessarily, in and of itself, we're getting there, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have positive evidence for the existence of God or any other question that mankind seeks after. So yes, these guys are wrong. These guys are responsible for a lot of the philosophical and societal thought that we're dealing with today as far as agnosticism, atheism, skepticism, whatever you want to call it. And they're wrong. But we can't just say they're wrong and walk away. We've got to keep going. So this begs the question, how is truth known then? We know that truth exists from what we talked about last week, but how do we know? How do we know what's true? We know truth exists and it's absolute and undeniable. To say truth can't be known is self-defeating because that implies that you know truth. If you're saying something is wrong or something can't be known, you're implying that you know something. You don't know if an answer is wrong unless you know it's wrong. So how do we know anything at all? The process of discovering truth begins with self-evident laws of logic. It's what we all have. They're called the first principles. They're things that, like contradiction. It doesn't take someone to be very old as a child to understand contradiction. Two things don't work together if they are opposites. So we have the law of non-contradiction, which we've been talking about. There's a second law, the law of the excluded middle. And that simply states that either God exists or he doesn't. There's no third option. Either does or he doesn't. Jesus either rose from the dead or he didn't. There's no third option. So we use these first principles to discover truth. But they alone can't tell us whether something is true. And an example here, let me try and make sense of this next one. So let's look at a good logical argument. All men are mortal. Spencer is a man. Therefore, Spencer is mortal. Makes sense? Logical. Flows. It's a good conclusion. However, the laws of logic don't tell us whether those premises, the premise and the conclusion are true. Yes, this logically makes sense. But logic alone doesn't tell us if it's true. Maybe all men aren't mortal. Maybe Spencer's not a man. Especially in 2022. Logic by itself can't tell us one way or another. And by example, all men are four-legged reptiles. Zachary is a man, therefore Zachary is a four-legged reptile. Logically, the argument's valid, right? Logically. But we know that it's not true, right? Why do we know it's not true? False claim. The argument's valid because the conclusion follows a premise, but the conclusion is false because the first premise is false. Make sense so far? In other words, an argument can be logically sound, but still as false because the premise of the argument did not correspond with reality. Obviously, men are not four-legged reptiles. So logic in and of itself, while valuable, isn't the end-all, the means to understanding.
Plus, if we go back to grade school, anytime you see all in a true-false statement, it's wrong.
So where do we get our general facts? Observation. Think about the last one. We observe men. We know men are four-legged reptiles. The method of drawing general conclusions from specific observation is called induction. Everybody write down the vocabulary words or we'll be a test. Now the process of lining up the premises in an argument and arriving at a valid conclusion is called deduction. This is how we discover our arguments about Zachary. Zachary were factually wrong. You observe that every man you've seen to be two-legged, not a reptile, but a mammal. Even same as Spencer, you know all men will someday die. General observation. It must be stated that most conclusions based on induction cannot be considered absolutely certain, but only highly probable. So, what does that mean? In the case of Spencer, all men die. Spencer's a man, therefore Spencer is immortal. He will die. But we can't say that with 100% fact because we haven't physically observed all men, right? However, it can get us to a point where it's within reasonable doubt that all men will die because everyone that we know, we've had a lot of people that we know have died. We know that's just how it is. But we haven't physically seen every single man. Same with the other one. If Zachary is not a two-legged, four-legged lizard, we can say that we know that he's not a four-legged lizard. However, we haven't seen every single man. Maybe one of us is a lizard out there.
That's a whole other topic.
Yeah, we're gonna get lost quick. The point is, this logic, while it's very helpful, it can steer us in good directions. It's not 100% accurate in and of itself. It's not 100% reliable.
So where do we go if it's not 100%?
We're gonna go where you're gonna go next week.
What do you think? If it's only 99% reliable?
Hey,
What, who said it? Faith. Yes, there is a place for faith.
Yep.
These guys that he's been talking about, the three different philosophers, well, to me, they're just really out there. But in each of the different areas that he described, the way that those philosophers believe, you can see how that then translates to what they might think about a supernatural being, a God. They're never going to get there. You can't see it, taste it, touch it, feel it, and so on and so forth, or all the other different things. We do believe, and we're going to talk about evidence of God and proof of God. We've never seen God. There is a place for faith in all this. And sorry, I didn't mean to get you off track.
But good. So we can be sure beyond all reasonable doubt, but not sure beyond all doubt. So yes, that's where faith comes in. Now, how are the truths about God known? So what does observation and induction have to do with discovering about the existence of God? Absolutely everything. Why? Observation and induction help us to investigate the ultimate religious question of all time. Does God exist? We use induction to investigate God the same way we use it to investigate other things that we just can't see, by observation of their effects. What does that mean? Okay.
I
How
can
so?
see gravity, but I don't believe the effects of it because I can see that something happens.
Have you dropped everything and know that gravity works on everything?
No, but I put enough together.
That's the
to
point of
realize-
induction, right? That's the deal, right? You can't know 100%.
Yeah, no, 100%.
Because, I mean, I don't know, maybe there's some element out there that will float. I don't know. So far, we don't have it right, but 99, reasonable doubt, without a doubt, reasonable doubt.
Who believes in
What's the
gravity?
courtroom one?
Who believes in gravity?
It's J. Warner Wallace's Cold Case Christianity is all about that. The whole book is about the reliability of the Gospels, and he talks about this in depth. I highly recommend it. He talks about inductive reasoning. We put people in jail based on reasonable,
Suspicion.
belief that something's more than likely the case. So there's an amount of faith there, but it's a reasonable faith because we've looked at all of the available evidence and said this is more than likely the true case.
That's the same, I mean, that's really the same thing that Paul writes to Romans in the first chapter of Romans, right? That since the beginning or the foundation of the world, it's been apparent to man by just that which is made. And if you don't understand, that doesn't tell you what God it is, but if you don't understand there's a God from that, then you're without excuse.
Absolutely.
That's where faith comes in with science, because science just shows evidence. So you got to take the evidence for yourself, and that's where the reasonable doubt comes in, because evidence doesn't 100% say that there's a God, but there's more evidence that says there is one than there is not.
That's why this book is so exciting for the Christian is your 2 points right there, because if we can say that, hey, here's some reasonable evidence. You make an argument from what you see around you. I forget what argument that is, the teleological element or the design argument. They both talk about it.
Intelligent design.
Yeah, basically, that you can say, the cosmic argument.
I think of the wind. We can't see the wind. No one's ever seen the wind, but you can feel the effects, right?
Well, it's exactly what Dylan was reading tonight. It's what God asked Job. Tell me, where did it come from? Where did it stop?
Yeah.
Can you tell me where it all started? Answer is no, we can't, but faith.
Yep. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead because we are out of time. So we're going to get more into those evidences. What we started at the beginning about the 3 reasons to believe in things, and then the evidence, as Haley was talking about. It's a culmination of evidence with the things we've been taught, whether it be our parents in the church. It's not blindly following what someone says, it's digging in, finding the evidence. And that's really going to start on the scientific side, historical side, starting next week. But real quick, just wrapping up. So what? Who cares about truth? What's the greatest problem in America today? Is it ignorance or apathy?
Yes.
I don't know and I don't care.
There you go. I don't know. Perfect answer. We're going to try and deal with that. We're out of time. Real quick. Leave you with these two verses. We know them well. I won't read them. Read them for yourself. But just remember why we're here. Why not only physically in the classroom, why we're here. It's to fight a battle. It's to fight for truth. Yes, there's truth. We have it. It's up to us to take it out there and to help people see it through their own willful ignorance, apathy, whatever it is. And it's our prayer and our aim that this class will help you with that. Any last questions? Anything else at all?
Well, I was just going to add to that it's not enough for us to say, well, it's true because I have faith that it is true. Because like you said at the beginning of the class, they don't care about this, right? But we need to be able to be prepared in season and out of season to argue from where they're sitting and say, have you thought about how reasonable this is, the evidence for God? So I think you're absolutely right.
All right.
How many people do you think don't believe in God versus those who hope there is no God?
That's a good point. Very good question.
Well, because a lot of people will say, I don't believe in God, but I hope I'm not wrong. Because everyone understands if you're wrong.
And the Greek word really behind the term agnostic is actually the same term behind ignoramus. No, it's
Yeah.
the same definition.
Yeah.